before I get started, like most writers, I have a day job, and right now I'm working at IBM Canada. I need to say very clearly that everything I'm about to talk about has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with my work at IBM, or indeed with anything that I am aware of IBM working on right now. These ideas are mine. They go back a good 20 years and appear in many publicly available stories. So, thank you. Who's ready for some science fiction, basically? Yeah. All right. Well, I want to talk tonight about a completely new vision of, I guess it's kind of convergence of nanotechnology, or the Internet of Things, blockchain technology, and artificial intelligence. Not very ambitious. But it is something I've been working on for quite a while, and hopefully you'll sort of be able to follow me down the end of this. It might be science fiction right now, but the people here at Waterloo are actually, a lot of them, engaged actively in building all of these technologies right now. So the current generation is going to see a lot of this stuff come to pass. So it's actually highly relevant, I think, for us to pre-imagine what this future is going to look like. And I have some bones to pick with the way it's imagined right now. First of all, I'm Karl Schroeder. I'm a science fiction writer and a futurist. Two disciplines which collide a lot in different ways in my work. For instance, 18 years ago, I wrote a novel called Ventus, my first novel, which was about a planetary scale Internet of Things, nanotech dust scattered over an entire terraformed planet that coordinated all of the terraforming systems of the world, and had been sent out in advance of the human colonists to bring the planet to life so that it would be a paradise when they arrived. Now, of course, when the human colonists arrive, the nanotech doesn't recognize them. Well, it sees these biological organisms and says, yes, they'll fit into the ecology we designed here. But it doesn't recognize their technology, so it knocks them back to the Stone Age. And the novel picks up 1,000 years later when a young mason's boy up on a wall starts having visions. So that was 18 years ago. And I've been thinking about all of that constellation of ideas, artificial intelligence and nanotechnology, ever since then. I've published recently a set of short stories that in different ways interrogate a new idea that I've been working on. For instance, in 2010, I published a story called Deodands. And in it, one of my favorite characters that I write about, a pathologically shy Ukrainian arms inspector named Gennady, fetches up in Vancouver with no money and gets a job investigating an artificially somewhat semi-intelligent robot that's supposed to be doing pest control in the forest. It's supposed to be killing animals, but it won't do it. And he goes to investigate why and finds out that the gold man, as it's called, has an ethics problem. But in the course of his investigation, he starts encountering more and more bizarre things that are going on in the Vancouver area. There's these cameras that are some kind of facial recognition system for crows. There's computer interfaces for animals in the woods that allow them to order up food in lean times and things like this. There's online corporations doing very strange things, and one, in fact, that turns out not to be owned by human beings at all, but to be owned by the local watershed, which has somehow become an economic actor on its own and is suing the city of Vancouver. So the story ends with that particular entity buying the robotics company that Gennady was working for, and so his investigation's just closed and he has to leave. But it's an example of the sort of take that I've been on with artificial intelligence for a while now. That take is basically the idea of AI is representing natural systems rather than people or the interests of human beings. And at this point in the talk, this is going to sound really abstract and probably of no particular connection to anything that we're doing or might be doing. But just bear with me a bit. Think, for instance, of the standard way that we think about and talk about artificial intelligence right now. We have a certain narrative about it. And lately that narrative's turned fairly ugly. So Elon Musk, for instance, the CEO of SpaceX and Tesla, has recently been very publicly declaring that artificial intelligence is actually a greater threat than nuclear proliferation. He carries a lot of clout. So when he says something like this, people listen. And he's not the only one saying it. I've had apparently sane people come up to me and tell me that there's a robot rebellion brewing, and we have to be ready for it. So if that's what's becoming kind of the standard narrative of artificial intelligence, where are we going with all this stuff? And what actually are we building? Apparently what we're building is Terminators, Skynet. One of my favorites, Colossus, the 1970 movie about a computer system that's designed to avert nuclear war, that decides that the only way to do it is by taking over the human race and ruling it with an iron hand. One of the precursors to this whole genre. Of course, HAL 9000, who doesn't take any orders. The computers of the Matrix, the rebellious robots of Westworld. Can you sort of see where all this is going? Right? This is our narrative about artificial intelligence, that as soon as we let it out of our grasp, it will become an adversary. And we appear to be very, very afraid of this. But there's an odd sort of mistake that I've noticed in this thinking. Because I'm a storyteller, I see things in terms of narrative, but I also notice narrative when I see it. And here I'm noticing a social narrative, a story that we're telling ourselves. And it's not a story about artificial intelligence. These creatures, the Matrix entities, the Terminator, they're not exhibiting artificial intelligence. Well, they might be intelligent, but that's all beside the point. What they're exhibiting is artificial desire. They're not dangerous because they're smart. They're dangerous because they want. And because their wants conflict with ours. But I don't think that's a particularly sophisticated way to actually think about artificial intelligence. I think we've missed the boat in actually analyzing what it is and what it could do. And in fact, we've built a whole paradigm here based on artificial desire that obscures something else much more important and much more, well, cool that could happen. See, the decisive question is not what an artificial intelligence can do, but what it thinks it is. For instance, in one of my novels, I had The Mighty Brick. The Mighty Brick is a brick that has had an artificial intelligence associated with it. The artificial intelligence believes that it is the brick. It believes that the brick's goals are its goals. What are a brick's goals? To lie there. So, normally it doesn't do very much, but if you threaten the brick, if you go to pick it up, if you do anything, it will sue you. It will summon miniature little jet aircraft that strafe you and chase you away. It will do all kinds of whatever is in its power to protect itself, because it is the mighty brick. this is where artificial intelligence starts to become interesting. When we begin to think about identity and what an artificial intelligence is going to think that it is. In the standard narrative, it thinks it's a death robot, or it thinks that it's the industrial system that builds it. But I have other ideas, and I think we can do much, much better. We're going to start to come full circle here to a planet of embedded nanotech sensors and that terraforms or controls itself. I'm going to remind you, if you don't already know, actually, there's been a lot of talk lately about giving rights to natural systems. Who here has heard about this? Oh.
About the monkey?
The monkey was one of them. There was this gibbon that had taken a photograph of it of itself, a selfie last year. And the question was, did it have a right to its own photo? But there's actually much more fundamental stuff going on. So for instance, let me make sure I get this right. The Wanganui River in New Zealand has been given legal personhood by the New Zealand government just in the last month. That is to say that that river is now a person. It has the rights of a person. Okay? And although, well, we know it can't think or anything like that, it can't do anything on its own, but there is a panel comprised of Maori and government people who can act on its behalf. So let's circle back around for a moment to the Vancouver watershed in the story Deodands. That is essentially what this river is. There is now a Deodand in the world. Deodand, by the way, is an Old English word. A Deodand is, in Old English law, an object that has killed someone and is now considered a person for the purposes of law. So, for instance, a cart wheel runs over somebody. So the cart wheel becomes a Deodand, becomes a ward of the court, and it might be punished by being broken up, or it might be sold, or something like that. This is an Old English perspective on the world, right? But in fact, Deodand is starting to become a relevant concept again because of things like this river. The nation of Ecuador has enshrined rights to natural systems in its constitution. And in fact, when it did that, Bolivia followed suit shortly afterwards. So this is not a one-time thing. In fact, the state of Pennsylvania in the United States has done something similar. So it's popping up all over the place. The idea that the right way to protect natural systems is to give them actual rights. There's a book called Should Trees Have Standing by Christopher D. Stone that you might want to check out to sort of get the full discussion on this. So, what am I talking about here? What's the full vision? Well, one of the people that I connected up with back in around 2014 was Stephan Tual, former CCO of Ethereum, the founder of Slockit, and now founder of Atlas Neue. Slockit, slock.it, is a very interesting Internet of Things company that also uses Ethereum blockchain technology. Basically, if you've got, say, a smart lock connected to the internet on your house, you can have an app on the internet that will unlock the door for someone who has negotiated an Internet of Things type contract for that door or for your house. So you can have your own Airbnb. Slockit can work with all kinds of different systems. this is the idea of smart contracts, and particularly smart contracts, which are a blockchain concept, married with Internet of Things technology. So the objects that you own now become agents or actors on their own, potentially. They can sell themselves or rent themselves. They can be somewhat like the mighty brick, but a little bit more friendly, let's say. So we're inching towards a world where the things we own have agency on their own, and the technical system that we're all embedded in can go away and do things on our behalf. That is, us as people. But what about other potential people? Now we've circled all the way back around. Let's take the Neue River, or the Great Lakes Basin, or any other system that might need to be protected. Now, the Great Lakes watershed or basin is a really good example of a natural system that needs protecting, but for which the systems that we have right now don't really work. How many states and provinces do you think border on the Great Lakes? Or on the rivers that flow into the Great Lakes? How many constituencies draw water? How many constituencies, like, for instance, Flint, put water back in that eventually ends up everywhere in the system? How do all of these states and constituencies coordinate and decide on courses of action together that will affect the Great Lakes Basin? It's an insanely difficult problem. And there's many others like it in the world. For instance, atmospheric carbon dioxide, which is a global problem, not owned by anybody. What I've proposed, and Stephan and I have been talking about this for a while. Well, if you could create a company like Slocket that allows you to automate opening the door of your house using a smart contract under certain contractual situations, why couldn't you create a system that monitors the health of a particular ecosystem, let's say, and then activates smart contracts of one form or another to do something in one way or another about it? Getting back to the Neue River, that panel that oversees the river it's made of human beings. It doesn't necessarily actually have the river's interests in mind. Human beings are notoriously fallible. It's also something called a third-party mediator. If you want to deal with the river, you go to the panel. Just like if you want to get a mortgage right now, you go to the bank. Well, one of the great visions of blockchain technology is, of course, getting rid of the bank, getting rid of the third party. So, this is the full vision of Deodands as it is being developed right now. It is the idea of an integrated set of smart contracts connected to sensor systems that monitor the health of ecosystems, or let's say pods of whales and so on and so forth, that engages in commerce or litigation and so on behalf of that ecosystem directly, without going through a panel or other human agency to do it. It is, in other words, the idea of artificial intelligence as a mechanism for waking up the natural world itself, so that the things in the world that we deal with but don't have a very good way of honestly dealing with can work and act on their own behalf as partners to humanity. In terms of artificial intelligence, this is the vision of AI as partner, or almost of artificial intelligence as a marriage between humanity and the natural world. And it's also a vision of how to solve a lot of our supposedly intractable problems about ecology, waste, pollution, and so forth. The whole thing is still in its infancy as a project, but we have all the pieces in place right now. It doesn't actually require intelligence in the artificial intelligence sense. It requires really well-designed smart contracts and really good sensor systems and a very sharp focus on what you want the natural system to be like, what its goals are. But if you think about it, you know, a forest isn't going to run amok and take over the world like Colossus. It's going to want to be a forest, like the mighty brick wants to be a brick. And so we don't actually have anything to fear from this particular vision of artificial intelligence. It's sort of the diametrical opposite of the paradigm that so terrifies Elon Musk and other people right now. And that's why I want to get the idea of it out there, regardless of whether we're successful in building it directly right now. The idea that artificial intelligence can be a partnership between equals who have nothing to fear from one another, I think is a new and important conversation to have. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Karl. We have 10 minutes for Q&A, so I will try and run up to whoever wants to ask any questions.
Thank you for that presentation. So we're looking at the new frontiers of actual sustainability. For purposes of illustration, can I give an example?
Yeah.
So we're looking at a protected water body, say some part of some ocean, where each time a ship or a vessel comes into that jurisdiction, that ship is automatically charged by the water.
Yeah, sure.
So this is a way of generating revenue by the sea to fund sea cleaning efforts. Because now we see all these trash removal subsystems. So we can actually realistically look at a future where our water bodies can sustain themselves.
Exactly.
This is beautiful.
Well, thank you. Nobody likes to be taxed, and it would be annoying to be taxed by the very body of water that you're sailing over. But the alternative seems to be that no one takes responsibility, and that's rapidly become literally unsustainable. So yes, this is a vision for sustainability.
Again, I'd like to thank for you, your time to talk. This is beautiful. I actually like the idea, but like you're saying, it's a shortcut to accountability. And I think that's the problem with humanity today. We're not accountable for what we do on this planet. And this is basically a shortcut.
Well,
in that sense that you're speeding up the process, that we can be accountable for what we do, and respect this planet the way that we should be doing.
Yeah, there are actually always situations in which accountability is an issue. So it's not like we're in a new regime where suddenly we're doing things that we're not accountable for. A lot of the issues that this idea is intended to solve have to do with commons or common pool resource allocation problems. Fisheries are a great example of that. So when you have a body of water that fish swim in and out of, even if you can declare that you own this section of water, the fish are always going in and out. You cannot fundamentally declare ownership and sovereignty over that resource. So it's always been a difficult area to govern. There are solutions, but this is, yes, sort of amping up or putting on steroids some of the approaches. Yeah?
Yeah, hi, Karl. Thanks, that was immensely thought-provoking. I'm going to try and come back with a thought. It has to do with the problems that one might try and address if one were a river. because the challenges that one faces and dare I say, the emotions one might experience would be something akin to fear of the activities of human beings. And human activities, which are causing harm to the system, are in effect deliberate outcomes, or outcomes of deliberate actions by human beings that are governed by human systems. So I guess I'm wondering, well, how does one propose changing the rules so that the river is in a position to protect itself from a human system that seeks, frankly, to protect itself and uses the river to that end?
Well, I'll be honest and say that I don't completely have an answer to that. Well, it is a difficult problem. Sorry, I'm tired, so I'm blanking suddenly. There are ecosystem services, for instance, that an entity such as a river could sell. If the river owns itself, then potentially it owns certain of the services that it can offer. If it can make a profit on that, it can litigate and so on. And so that's one of the ideas that I've used in some of my fiction. But that's only a sort of half measure. And I think the very idea of speaking to a river or getting a phone call from the river saying, "You threw something into me yesterday," could also be effective. I don't know yet, but I suspect that when we start to treat anything as a person, whether it's another person that we have never treated as a person, or whether it's a natural system, or whether it's an animal, the choices that we make regarding it change. And the limit vision of this vision of artificial intelligence is of literally speaking to the world and having the world in its various parts speak to us as an equal. And when that happens, in this limit vision, it would be profoundly uncomfortable for people to ignore what the natural world is saying and continue to pollute it. I wanted to mention just an example of a slightly different kind of Deodand. Let's say you had a suicidal artificial intelligence. It wanted itself to cease to exist, and it thinks that it is a particular kind of pollution, let's say lead pollution. Its aim is to make itself go away. That would be another kind of artificial intelligence we could imagine, although it's kind of mind-bending and kind of depressing as well to think about how that one would work. Did we have another?
Yeah, thank you for your talk, Karl. I was curious, when you mentioned how well the smart contracts would need to be designed for these types of systems, could you comment on who would bear the responsibility for decision-making related to those design choices?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Anybody here remember the DAO, the DAO from, about a year and a half, 2 years ago? And the whole idea of code is law. Well, this is kind of the Platonic notion that if we program it, it miraculously will understand the world and work perfectly. Well, no, that's not going to happen. Whatever you program in any system has to have some kind of interface into the physical world, or it's completely useless. And in the case of smart contracts, they actually need a number of different kinds of connectors into the world. The most commonly talked about is something called an oracle. So for a smart contract to work, let's say the lock that I mentioned earlier in the door that unlocks itself when the Airbnb customer arrives. For that to work, there has to be some kind of sensor that says the door was opened, that it was closed, that the person was there, that they left. These are all oracle functions, and they cannot be done by software. There has to be an interface to the outside world, which is either some kind of really accurate and trustworthy sensor system, or a person or persons. So for the Deodands, as I imagine them, In the novel that I've just finished, in Virtua, which will be coming out next fall, 2019, people act on behalf of Deodands often. They act as oracles. There's a sort of blur or spectrum between Deodands that are like the Wanganui River, completely human represented, and ones that are completely machine represented. But the plot of the story revolves around that contentious spot where the sensors might or might not be trustworthy. And that's a place we're going to be living for a good long while when it comes to smart contracts.
Thank you, Karl, for the presentation. Is excellent, as I expected it to be. Just a quick question. Correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned about the artificial desire. Was that?
Yeah.
The artificial desire. Just making an assumption out of curiosity that people in general, their social interactions, is their artificial desire is identity. What would happen, in your opinion, if, as you talked about the money brick, is an identity, and it has its own identity crisis where it seeks beyond identity and loses that desire for identity, and now it goes so that it doesn't need identity anymore?
Depends on how well it's programmed, I suppose.
Well, assuming that artificial intelligence goes beyond it's self-programming.
Yeah, well, the idea of AI going beyond its self-programming is one of the core plot devices of science fiction, right? The question is, can we design AI that can't do that? For instance, you could have a completely blockchain-based, blockchain all the way down, computing system where everything had to be validated. In a sense, that's what we are. Biological organisms have 500 million years, or animals have 500 million years of programming at every level, from the whole organism to the parts to the individual cells, all of which make us into the self-interested beings that we are. So that it's almost impossible for us to imagine a being that would not, on some level, have the kind of drives that we do. But I'm going to encourage you to imagine that. Imagine that intelligence, awareness, even consciousness, don't necessarily have anything to do with this drive to survive, to exceed our own programming, as it were, that we have. I really do think that AI could be fundamentally different in that regard. A lot of stories have computers reasoning themselves into breaking free of the human bondage, as it were. And I just actually don't buy that. I think a well-programmed system is not going to be aware of its limits, just as cognitive science has shown that we're not aware of most of our own thinking processes. We could talk about this one all night, I think.
And we don't have all night, so. Anybody else? We got a couple more minutes? Okay, we'll take one more, and then we'll wrap it up. A couple more community announcements, and then go have some drinks and networking.
I think the real danger of combining artificial intelligence with the blockchain is that artificial intelligence can be self-sustained over the blockchain because the blockchain is immutable. So that Elon Musk worries about this. We need a way to have a governance about the way we write software or blockchain artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence can be self-sustained through a payment method, and you will not be able to turn it off because it's decentralized around the world.
Yeah, you don't have to have artificial intelligence involved to have that particular problem. The blockchain is, by its very nature, a template for absolute tyranny if it were abused, which is a story that has not yet been written properly, but maybe I'll do. Do we have time? There was one more hand up in the back.
Can you speak
In
louder?
the microphone.
Okay.
Just a final thought. So if we have rivers that are looking after themselves and are intelligent, and what happens if they assess us as a mortal threat to themselves?
Well, I assume that they do right off the bat. Like that's the whole idea is that these things are designed in the way that I have written about them as what are called rational economic actors. They act to maximize their utility, and yet of course they see us as threats. But like any embodied being, there's only so much that they can do in the world. The best strategy is basically to work with us rather than against us. Although at the end of my novel, there's kind of an uprising of the Deodands. You'll have to buy it to see. But in the end, they basically come to the same conclusion. Part of it is because human beings are part of the systems. So for a forest example, the humans who live in the forest are part of the forest. So the forest would not act against their interests. If you see what I mean. The identity is very strange in this kind of thing. But I had to write a whole novel to sort of get into the details of that, and it'll be about a year before it's out. But you'll see it soon. Thanks.
Thank you.